Welcome to this edition of Valor Media. This is episode number 54 for February 15th, 2021. I'm your host, Mark Appenzeller, and today's episode is entitled Hidden in Plain View. Now, if you joined us last week, you know that was our one-year anniversary episode for Valor Media, and Lori Riston and I discussed where the podcast got its start, what we've done in the last 12 months, where we expect things to go as we move forward. And it was a really exciting start of year number 2. And one of the interesting byproducts for me is that in talking about the origin of the podcast, talking about how it has developed, it really allowed me to get a deeper insight into how things played out and how they went, in some instances, in kind of a different direction than we originally thought. Now, if you listened last week, you know that the podcast initially got its start as a concept that Lori came up with years ago for a radio show. But the radio show never gathered any traction, and instead of just falling by the wayside, it got morphed into a format which became the template for Valor Media as a podcast. Now, for me personally, when we launched the podcast in February of 2020, I wasn't quite sure what we would be doing with it. We had some goals. We had sort of a basic framework. But I thought, particularly in terms of our listening audience, that we would just impact our local geographical area. Little did I know that over the course of those 12 months, there would actually be listeners all over the world. We never dreamed a year ago that that would be the case. At least I certainly didn't. I never thought, somebody in Ireland is going to listen to this. Someone in Russia is going to hear this podcast. It's amazing to me. I'm always fascinated. How did they find us? What is it about what we're sharing that resonates with them? And the craziest part is that was nowhere at all in my game plan when I was working out some of the nuts and bolts on my end as we started this a year ago. Now, what I want to talk about with this idea of hidden in plain view is the fact that I think all of us have a tendency, as we move forward in life, to have pretty preconceived notions about the way things should play out. I think that that's inevitable to some degree, and I think a lot of it is caused by the fact that we live in an incredibly fast-paced world. We're barraged every day with thousands of images, hundreds of thousands of words, both spoken and in text. We hear sound bites, we see video clips, and we're constantly trying to process all of this information. We're also living in a world where we kind of have this expectation that our daily schedules should be jam-packed. We rush to work, we leave work and pick the kids up and take them to soccer practice. We run to the grocery store, we run to the bank. We're always running. There's always the next errand. We're always thinking about what's the next number on the list. And because of that, sometimes I think we don't really give our full attention to what's immediately in front of us because we're anticipating when this obligation is taken care of, what's the next one? That can be a really terrible way to live, because we get so much clutter, we get so much on our plate that we don't know where to start. And we exhaust ourselves because we just kind of get sucked into that vacuum. It goes along week after week. We convince ourselves that, that's the way life should work. And the problem is, when we pursue something that's outside of the scope of that, we don't know how to disassociate ourselves from that daily grind. I think when we're pursuing something, some goal that we have put out there on the horizon, we need to recognize that it needs to be given room to maneuver. But we tend to throw everything back in that box of, what's next? Why hasn't this happened yet? Well, I didn't think this was going to take as long as it did. And that's because that's what daily life looks like. It's a real discipline. It's a self-awareness. And that's a really critical component because no matter what it is that you're doing, if it's not lining up with what God wants to see happening for you or for your organization, you have problems right there. It's hard enough sometimes to walk everything out if you really have a confidence that God is directing your steps. But you have to first of all establish, is this what I should be pursuing? Now, if you listen to Valor Media, you know that we have two different series that our episodes fall into. One is Crisis to Thriving, which focuses really on the individual. It's understanding how a relationship with Jesus Christ will alter the way you make life choices, the way you interact with other people, and what that will mean as your life unfolds. We also have the Valor XL series, where we kind of disseminate all of our experience that we've gathered at the Valor Crisis and Training Center so that we can share practical experience to other agencies and organizations and businesses to help them work more effectively, to do things more expediently. And they're kind of two sides of the same coin, because it really comes down to trying to assess things properly. And that's what I wanted to talk about today with this idea of hidden in plain view. Now, I tend to be a very goal-oriented person, both in a professional capacity and just on a personal level. I like to establish, okay, I'm here, but I believe that I should be there. What do I have to do to get from here to there? Now, if you talk to my wife, she will also tell you that I tend to be an overanalyzer. I know, and I admit it, I tend to overthink things. I've always said, for me, there's no such thing as too much information. I'd rather have all the information and use my own filters to decide what I don't need than to just get bits and pieces and somehow try to connect the dots. Now, that works for me in some cases, but a lot of times I think I do overthink things and I tend to drag my feet. Now, I'm no fan of just going off blindly and saying, well, I hope this works. I think you do need to do your due diligence. You need to research things. You need to investigate things. You don't want to be blindsided by something that you could have easily avoided if you had just disciplined yourself to look a little bit more deeply. But you also can't get so in the weeds that you get permanently hung up on the details. If you overanalyze everything, you will never do anything because you'll constantly be saying, yeah, but what about this? Yeah, but what about that? So as you pursue something, a personal goal or an organizational goal, you first of all do have to establish, is this something that God wants me to pursue? And if the answer to that question is yes, then you've already got a large component dealt with. Now, we are told in the Bible that the Lord will give us the desires of our heart. Now, I personally think that that carries two meanings. I think it means that He deposits desires into our heart, that the things that are really of Him, the goals, the ambitions, the pursuits, the passions that burn inside of us, that motivate us and inspire us, if they're truly of Him, they're planted in us by Him. He gave them to us. I think that's definition number one. But I also think it means that the things He put in us, He will allow to come to pass. He will give them to us. I think we have to understand what that looks like. And in Romans chapter 8, the Apostle Paul told us all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. And the catch is a lot of people read the first part of that and they don't read the and. You have to incline your ear to hear, God, what's your purpose in this? Because if we don't do that, even if we're pursuing something that's godly, even if we're doing something that He wants us to do, if we don't ask, yeah, but what exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Lord? Then what will happen is we'll start on that journey saying, it can only look this way. It can only fit into that slot. And that becomes incredibly dangerous because what happens is if things don't pan out the way that we think they should, if we don't see things unfolding according to the timetable that we imposed, we get despondent. I know for me personally, that's been a struggle different times. Things that I thought should have happened years ago and they didn't. And I used to get very pulled down by that. And I thought, but wait a minute, this should have happened way back whenever. Well, how do I know? If I'm trusting that God is working something out in me, then I also have to trust Him that He'll do it in His time, because He understands it a lot better than I do, and He is outside of time. He sees the beginning and the end, so He'll make it work. We get ourselves deluded sometimes into saying, okay, I've begun this journey. I have started this project. I am in pursuit of this goal. And if we're not careful, God may be unfolding miraculous things directly in front of us, but we're not even aware of it. we miss the small things. We also sometimes get into that rut of saying, okay, Lord, here we go, but we don't really relinquish control of how it plays out to Him. And if we keep our hand on everything too tightly, then we, as a byproduct of that, have to shoulder all the responsibility for figuring out how to do it, all of the pressure, all of the demands that accomplishing it will entail. It falls 100% on us as a human being to make it happen. And if we start off that way, we're pretty much doomed to fail, because usually the big things that God puts in our hearts are too big for us to accomplish in ourselves. He puts those things in us, massive, huge, way beyond our scope, so that we can only accomplish whatever they are through Him. And that can be a really delicate balance. We can be pursuing something He wants us to do, but we're still trying to make it all happen. Now, I do believe we have to put our hand to the plow of the kingdom of God. We're still human beings. We're still in a natural world interacting with other people. We have to work. We have to be diligent. We have to be perseverant. But we also have to let God be God. And we have to recognize that things will sometimes play out differently than we thought that they should, and that's actually okay. Now, I wanted to mention something that I think is interesting that sort of touches on a couple of different concepts here, and it also goes along with the idea of really not despising small beginnings. Because I think one of the greatest dangers of starting on a long journey toward a goal is that, again, if we have the preconceived notion of, I should see that I've reached this particular milepost by now, if we don't get to that milepost, we can say, well, this will never amount to anything. We talk ourselves out of so much. We allow our enemy, Satan, to whisper to us and say, yeah, this was doomed to fail from the beginning. Yeah, this was never going to work. Yeah, you're not smart enough to make this happen. And we digest all of that and we say, yeah, you know what, you're right. And the next thing you know, it's 2 years later and we haven't taken one single step toward what we were pursuing. That's completely debilitating to us as believers in Jesus Christ, because we are more than conquerors. We're more than overcomers. We have the ability through Christ to live out, to act out, to fulfill whatever He deposited in us. Now, I wanted to touch on this idea, hidden in plain view. I'm always fascinated by an Edgar Allan Poe short story called The Purloined Letter. And it's basically a detective story. And in the story, there's this extremely important letter that is stolen. And the police basically are convinced that they know who stole it, but they can't find the letter. They've searched the guy. It's not on his person. They've gone and searched his house at times when he wasn't there, and they can't find it. And the fascinating thing is when they're searching his house, they're looking in hiding places. They're looking between pages of books. They're looking in all of these spots that they would perceive as a location someone would hide something. You find out a little bit later on, and spoiler alert, that the letter the entire time was hidden in plain view. It was actually hidden with other pieces of mail. They didn't even think to look at that. They were convinced, well, he would obviously have it somewhere that we would never be able to find. And so they continually walked right past the letter, not even recognizing that it was directly in front of them. We do that so many times as God is unfolding something. He's saying, right here is what I'm trying to do, but we're saying, oh no, but it could only look like that. We're bending over trying to pick up a dime, and there's a $100 bill fluttering down behind us. We're focusing on the wrong thing, and sometimes we're despising the small beginnings. We have no idea how much influence we exert over others. Sometimes that's part of the problem too. Sometimes we put all of our energy and attention on what we think is going to be the big ticket item, and little do we know at the end of the day, it may not really amount to much. We can strive for years on something that we're convinced this is what it's all about, and we never see any fruit. And then we find out later on that something that we did just as part of our daily routine, something that was so intrinsic to who we are, wound up being the big game changer. We ended up blessing somebody. We ended up developing something. We ended up making progress. We ended up enriching somebody's life through something that we just act out without even thinking about it because it's part of who we are. That's a really tough perspective sometimes. It's difficult to split between those two because we automatically assume again, oh, it has to look this way. Do we really know best? If you ever get a chance, I really suggest that you visit the Outer Banks of North Carolina, an incredibly beautiful place. And if you go there, you have to visit the small town of Kitty Hawk. Now, at Kitty Hawk, you will find the Wright Brothers National Memorial. This is dedicated to Wilbur and Orville Wright, and it was in that exact spot on December 17th, 1903, that the Wright brothers conducted the first powered flight. That was the beginning of flight. It's incredible to stop and think about that. And when you're there, it's so built up and so touristy around there now that you kind of lose the perspective. But if you see photographs of it in 1903, Kitty Hawk was an incredibly barren place. There was hardly anyone living there. It was very, very sparsely populated. It was basically sand dunes and wind and surf. And it was on that spot that the Wright brothers began modern flight. And if you look at the flight by today's standards, it really doesn't look all that amazing. It only lasted about 10 seconds, and it only went about 120 feet. Now, what would have happened if they had said, well, you know what? We didn't cross the Atlantic. You know what? We didn't break the sound barrier. What a failure. They could have walked away from all of that and said, that was just a complete waste of time. But see, those things were destined to come later. And if the Wright brothers hadn't done what they did at Kitty Hawk that day, none of those other things would have happened later on. The Spirit of St. Louis would not have been flown across the Atlantic by Charles Lindbergh. All the other later developments were built on that humble beginning, that very seemingly small event that completely changed the future of transportation. Now, there's another interesting thing at the Wright Brothers Memorial that I also find really fascinating. I haven't been inside that building for many, many years, but I have a good friend who has visited it since I was there, and he told me about something that I thought was really interesting. Now, Valor Ministries is located in Hagerstown, Maryland, and in Hagerstown, there was a local company. I'm not even sure if they're still in business, but it was called Duvenage, and their primary product was manufacturing metal spiral staircases. And I remember as a kid riding by the factory, they had one of these spiral staircases outside on display. Well, my friend was telling me many years ago that he and his wife went to the Wright Brothers Memorial, and he said it was really interesting. Here he is in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and as he's walking into the memorial, he looked up, and the very first thing he saw directly above him was the words Hagerstown, Maryland. Well, he was looking at a Duvenage spiral staircase. It's fascinating because there are millions of people that have walked underneath that, looked at it. If they read it, they were probably like, what's that? Where is that? It doesn't really mean anything to most people, but it fascinates me because that, again, kind of ties back into what I said before and what we experienced in this first year of Valor Media. You never know where your influence will go. Now, most people probably never even think to investigate. They could care less. They're there to see the history of the Wright brothers. But it's fascinating that Hagerstown is displayed above everyone's head. It's there for them to look up at. And it's just an interesting little influence that something manufactured here wound up being utilized in a national memorial. It's that whole idea, again, of sometimes things are right in front of us and we don't notice them. I'm sure millions of people walked under that staircase and never looked up. So the Wright brothers accomplished something that changed the future of transportation, and they didn't shoot themselves down because it wasn't some miraculous, incredible long-distance flight that kicked everything off. Also, the influence of a manufacturing plant in a little town in western Maryland is felt in a place maybe most people don't even know or care that it's there, but there's a component in that Wright Brothers Memorial that came from here. I'm saying all of that to say, As you pursue whatever God puts in your heart, if you first of all establish that it really is His perfect purpose and will, understand that He will cause it to come to pass if you trust Him and if you allow Him to direct your steps. Don't expect things to only fall into a certain mold, because chances are pretty good God will not do it the way you think He will. His ways are higher than our ways. So don't despise the small beginnings. Don't sell yourself short. Never underestimate the influence that you can have. And try to develop a discernment. Is the big thing I'm throwing myself into what it's really all about? Or is God going to bless some little fragment? One thing I've learned after walking with the Lord for years is He seems to delight in using broken pieces, fragments, a remnant. He likes to take the things that have been discarded by the world and do something amazing with them. And He gets to do that because then, at the end of the day, no human being can say, it's because I'm so smart, I'm so clever, I'm so rich. At the end of the day, He gets the glory and the honor because He did something we weren't expecting. And if we're not careful, He'll do something that, because of our preconceived notions, is hidden in plain view. I pray for you in your personal life, in your business life, that you really develop spiritual eyes to really see what God is doing, to appreciate those very seemingly small things, because they can be as a mustard seed. They can explode into some miraculous thing. They can reach out and touch lives in ways you may never even know. Trust Him. He will cause all things to work together for good if you're called according to His purpose. He has a great purpose for you. He has a great purpose for every single one of us. It all begins with coming into relationship with Him. If you're not walking with Jesus Christ, if you haven't really figured out how to make that connection, if you're grappling with the whole idea of faith and what does it mean to be a Christian, I really encourage you to reach out to us. If you contact us at info@thevalorcenter.org, someone from the Valor Ministry staff will get back in touch with you. We want to help answer your questions. We want to help point you in the direction of Jesus Christ. He is the only way. And if you put your life in His hands, if you put your faith in Him, if you trust that He will work everything out for good, you have no idea where He's going to take you. But I do know it'll be great. It'll be more than you ever could have figured out or done on your own. And we want to help be a part of that. And if you find yourself at a place of crisis right now, whatever that looks like, I'd like to suggest a great resource, a new book by Lori Riston called You Were Made to Thrive, 7 Strategies to Move You from Crisis to Thriving. It's available at Amazon.com and at www.valorxl.com/products. I really encourage you to learn more about what Valor Ministries is all about by visiting us on Facebook at Valor Ministries and Valor XL. You can visit our websites, www.thevalorcenter.org and www.valorxl.com. If you have suggestions for topics that you'd like us to share with you in future installments, please contact us at media@thevalorcenter.org. And if the Valor Media Podcast is an encouragement to you, if it inspires you, if it challenges you to look differently at the way you're living your life, please subscribe to it. Please follow it. We do publish a new episode each week. And if we're blessing you through this podcast, would you consider blessing us by financially contributing so that we can continue to bring content like this to you week after week? If so, you can make your tax-deductible donation securely online by going to www.thevalorcenter.org/donate, or you can send a check or money order to Valor Ministries, 324 East Antietam Street, Suite 104, Hagerstown, Maryland, 21740. Thank you so much for joining me today. Please come back next week for another installment of Valor Media. Until then, remember this: you were made to thrive.